Hello and welcome to another Marshall Moment. My name is Rob Havers, the president of the George C. Marshall Foundation, located here on the post at the Virginia Military Institute in Lexington, Virginia. And today I am delighted to be joined by Dan Holt, past director of the Dwight D. Eisenhower Presidential Library in Abilene, Kansas, and also the managing editor of volumes 6 and 7 of the Papers of George Catlett Marshall. So very good to have you here, Dan.
Nice to be back.
Indeed, thank you for joining us. You are uniquely qualified, really, to speak about both George C. Marshall and Dwight D. Eisenhower. I'd like you to begin this Marshall moment really by perhaps summarizing what it is you think about George C. Marshall today in 2018 and how you think history sees him.
Well, I think there's any question, he probably has more respect with young people and students today because of the Marshall Plan, the foreign policy, the foreign relations, because they don't necessarily relate to World War II period. They know he was the boss of everyone in World War II, but we travel in Europe a lot, and Europeans all know what the Marshall Plan was, even today, young people. I'm not sure I can say that about a lot of United States people. So I think he's held in great respect, and I think part of it comes from the sense that he was able to maintain a non-political persona all those years, and so he didn't get controversial except briefly at the Secretary of Defense appointment, and I'll go into that in my talk. But Marshall's one of those names, when you hear it today, you immediately get an image. Even young people, I think, the man in uniform or in uniform as a civilian. And people forget that's Marshall's uniform when he was Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense. Right. He felt the same way. I think I've never run across anyone that has made a remark that was not approving of Marshall in some ways. Now, some people don't agree with some things he did, which is natural. A lot of people thought the China mission was a failure, but as a lot of historians have written, there was no American solution to the China situation, and Marshall was caught in that. Right. But he didn't hold that against anybody. So that's sort of a thumbnail, and I will talk more in detail about it in my lecture. But I learned a lot on working on the Marshall Papers, I guarantee you. I thought I knew quite a bit, right. But you've got to get into those documents. You've got to read what these men are doing and what's going on behind the scenes to really appreciate it.
The 7-volume collection of the edited papers of George Catlett Marshall, one of the major achievements of the Marshall Foundation, and we have 3 of the volumes sitting right here, published between the 1980s and 2016. And Dan, you were managing editor for volumes 6 and 7. Yes. What were some of the challenges of that role?
Well, I had done some documentary editing before. I was the editor of Eisenhower's pre-war diaries and selected papers, which everyone wanted to see because of the Philippine Diary and MacArthur. Mm-hmm. The challenges of documentary editing is that you're only in the moment of the document. You right. Don't look ahead. Now, you can look backwards. But, and my very good friend Mark Stoller, who's the editor and who's a true historian in the best sense, I had to kind of get on Mark once in a while. I said, Mark, you're writing history in these footnotes, we can't do that. Right. You take a document that Marshall or Eisenhower or somebody wrote, and you have to place it totally in the context of the day it was written. That's it. But then you have to identify the content so you understand what the letter is saying. And you may have a 1-paragraph letter that takes a footnote that's 2 pages long. On the reverse of that, you may have a 3-page letter, it takes 3 lines in the footnote. Right. So the challenge is really to commit yourself to making sure you're sticking with the facts that relate to that document. It's frustrating because I know what happened, you know. But then the secret is you have to cross-reference all this throughout the volume. Because as you move in dates, this document here applies way back here again and answers some of the questions here. You have to cross-reference this. Cross-referencing is a madhouse in this situation And we would maintain lists of first mentions. When was this person first mentioned, or this topic first mentioned, so that we knew where to go back for the cross-reference. It's sort of mind-boggling in a way, but it does require somebody who's very adept at handling history. I mean, handling history, not necessarily interpreting.
Well, and the 7-volume series is a major accomplishment, and you and the team did a tremendous job.
Well, there are our predecessors in that project, Larry Bland and Sharon Stevens, did a remarkable job too. And we were fortunate, the initial stage of our tenure, that we had Sharon around still for about a year. But from then on, it was basically our ballpark from then on. But yeah, it's really fascinating to connect. I'm going to mention this several times in my talk tomorrow. Is what we don't know from these people is what's not written.
Right.
The connections, the behind the scenes things. And I would go into that on 2 or 3 things with Marshall and Eisenhower, which is a remarkable similarity in their careers. It's amazing. They're 10 years difference. And they died 10 years different. It's sort of one of those little things you look at. You know, Marshall was born in 1880, Eisenhower in 1890. Marshall dies in 59, Ike in 69. Boy, now I suppose somebody can make something of that. I have no idea how.
Yes, that's interesting. Talking about Eisenhower, every day at the Marshall Foundation we think about how do we keep alive the memory, the legacy, the knowledge of what Marshall did and who he was from the Marshall Foundation here in Lexington. You had a similar role, obviously, as the director of the Eisenhower Presidential Library. How did you think about the mission when you were in charge of the Presidential Library there?
Well, the Federal Presidential Library, part of the National Archives. The museum is our really outreach, you know. But now we put in educational programs when I was there that outreached, and all the modern technology was coming in. But its relevancy. You've got to make, if young people walk in, why is Eisenhower relevant to this time period? And that's difficult sometimes. And especially with video games and all this, you know, which they don't have an Eisenhower or a Marshall video game, which they probably should. But it was always a struggle, it really was. But I think once you get the young people hooked, then the adults will come around. And fortunately, when I went on board at the Eisenhower in 1990, it was the Eisenhower centennial birth year.
Right.
We had 55,000 people on the lawn on his birthday. And Colin Powell and Winston Churchill II had been there. Right. Or, you know, and Billy Graham. These people all showed up in Abilene, Kansas. There's your respect. And that drew a lot of attention from a lot of people. Right. These men, leaders, really still understand the importance of honoring somebody like Eisenhower. But you got to get away from putting it on a pedestal too. You got to show the mistakes. You got to show the problems they had, and Eisenhower certainly had them. But I think being able to expand our education department when I was there and having education director was really important, really was, because I'm not qualified to come up with lesson plans kind of things.
Right.
So that we had to do, but it's. And especially location's important, and a lot of people say, well, I'm not going to go to the middle of Kansas, you know, to see this. But visitation is very good. Now, we redid most of the museum under my tenure, and now they're redoing the entire museum again.
Oh, they really? Yes.
We have to do it every 15 years or so.
That's absolutely right. Yeah. You do have refresh and new ways of telling that story.
But I was really proud of Five-Star Leaders, we called it, program where they had to go through the scenario of making a decision on D-Day. We supplied them documents we very carefully picked so they could read them in a hurry and make sense of them, because some military documents are very difficult to understand. And they went through the whole process, and they made a decision.
Right.
And they were in teams, and they came up, and one was the weatherman, one was, you know, they played the roles. We had 2 didn't go. You know, and then we had a counterfactual. Said, this is what would have happened, or maybe what would have happened. And I remember the best, I think, comment we had was from a young lady student, and she said, you know, ever June 6th, I'll remember what happened on that day. You can't ask for any more.
No, that's right,
You really
absolutely
can't.
not.
But that's the outreach. Of course, the archive side of it, that pretty well sells itself. I mean, the researchers are going to come for that. But we did have programs that utilized young people using the materials in the library. And there's something about it, and I still say this, and we were a little guilty of this when we redid parts of the museum, that we sort of got away from the documents. And it's still amazing when a young person looks at a real document, they're really impressed.
Right.
This is really it.
There is a power to that, absolutely.
Yeah, there really is.
Thinking about these two men, Marshall and Eisenhower, how would you characterize their relationship, Dan?
Very close. I'll go into this in detail again in my lecture. I'm very careful, and it took me a long time to assess this. They were never friends. And you don't have to be friends with people you work for to be effective. I think this helped. They weren't. Because I say in my lecture that they didn't have to be concerned with maintaining a friendship.
Right.
No matter what we did, we understood each other. If we disagreed, we understood each other. We accepted it, and we moved on. A wonderful, wonderful relationship, really. But there's so many remarkable similarities between the two and their whole development of their careers. They're different, but they're very similar. And the people they knew,
Right.
who they didn't know, they both knew them.
Right.
When I was at the Citadel, I basically was there to manage General Mark Clark's papers. They hired me as director of the Citadel Museum and Archives, but really Clark is retiring.
Right.
And he gave his papers to the Citadel, so I came in as a manuscripts person to organize all this. And that relationship is important with Eisenhower particularly, but also with Marshall. Because Marshall and Clark served together at Fort Lewis, Washington in the 30s. And they were helping Eisenhower get him out of the Philippines from under MacArthur. You know, there's little things back there that we have to deal with, and I don't know how important they are. I'll let the other historians worry about that. But total respect, and
Right.
they trusted each other.
Right.
I think that's important. They trusted each
Right.
other. If Eisenhower did something and Marshall didn't agree with it, he still trusted him to do it.
Right.
And they understood why he did it. Remarkable.
Inevitably, people ask us at the Marshall Foundation, Marshall's feelings on not being named the Overlord Commander, Eisenhower obviously having that challenge, that opportunity. And we think about what Marshall felt about that decision. What did Ike think about
He was
that
surprised.
decision?
He was surprised Marshall chose him. Now, see, it was Eisenhower's idea there has to be one overall commander in the whole European theater. That would mean that he was also the overall commander of the invasion.
Mm-hmm.
It never crossed Eisenhower's mind that he would do it
Right.
or be chosen. Marshall did it. It was Marshall who told Roosevelt, Eisenhower's the guy to do this. And it really surprised him. But that lasted about 2 minutes, and then it was back to work. One thing, Marshall was better in Washington.
Right.
I use this phrase in my lecture, he's a diplomat among warriors, and he can handle that. I'm not sure he could have handled the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the UK. Totally different personalities here.
Right.
Eisenhower could do it. He could slap you on the back and give you the big smile, but you better be careful because that puts you too much at ease with him, and he could take you apart in a minute if he had to. But it's all personality there. Eisenhower got along very well, even with General Sir Alan Brooke, which was not easy to get along with, and Montgomery. And I think it was a great choice. Whether Marshall thought of this or Roosevelt, I think Marshall may have sensed that. Eisenhower can deal with this. And after having been to the Philippines and MacArthur for 4 years, he could deal with anything.
Right. Right.
Sorry, but
Dan Holt, it has been a pleasure. Thank you for joining us for this Marshall moment.